La Crosse's Northside Stories podcast featuring Bill Temte is sponsored by Willow Heights. Find Willow Heights subdivision just 18 minutes from the mall. Find them at willowheightswi.com.
What I liked best about the Northside was simply that it was exactly that, simple. It wasn't any classification of people and stuff. And we had some people that lived down there in the 40s and the 50s that had some money. And one person, a neighbor down the street, owned a service transfer company and lived in a nice brick house a block down on the street from me. And his son was my brother's and my best friend. But there was no we got, you don't got kind of feeling between anybody. And there was the shop owners, and there was the factory workers. And the one I didn't mention about when we were driving around was the old Pilat company, processing the tobacco from Vernon County mostly, and making cigars and chewing tobacco, I'm told. That's that big brick building that is now an apartment building by the Northside beach.
Oh, okay.
And when we first came back from my military, my wife and I, looking for apartments, decided we'd go in there and see what it was like. Well, the tobacco smell was still so bad, particularly the hallways and the stairways, that we climbed up 2 floors and climbed back down 2 floors and went elsewhere. But that was another place that employed quite a few people. Most of those, like I said, as we were driving around, people tended to live closer to where they worked than people do today, of course. The simplicity and the acceptance. For instance, right across the street from my father's small meat market grocery store, it was a few canned goods was the extent, and produce.
Right.
Was that. But right across the street was a very good liquor store. And the fellow who had the liquor store had a sedan, and he also had a pickup truck. Twice a week, my brothers and sister, mom and dad would get in the back of the pickup truck. They'd get in the seat, and us kids, 4 kids, and we'd go up as far as you can go on Z to where the Black River comes under the railroad bridges then.
Right.
And fish all day and have meals and stuff. And then at 5 o'clock or so, we'd all pile back in the back of the pickup truck and head back to George Street, say.
Let me ask you this. When you guys were in your car, were you wearing seatbelts?
There were no seatbelts. And we didn't have a car. That's the other thing about it. Many people, like my next door neighbor, he had a car, but it was in the garage 90% of the time. He worked as a custodian at the post office, and he would simply get on the bus and go to his work downtown, where the only post office was in those days, and the car would come out of the garage once in a while when the family would maybe go for a Sunday drive. That was a nice big deal. And they'd invite me, because I was a good friend of one of the sons, and they'd invite me to ride along with them. But cars just were not used on neither the north or the south side to the extent they are now, but the south side was much more car-oriented. First of all, it was spread out over a lot more area, so using the car was more of a sense. Like the old train company, that was way on the south ditches of La Crosse. And in fact, where the village shopping center, what was called the village shopping center?
Yep.
Before that was built, there was one small restaurant which would be back about where the Central High School football field is, and a little path road going back there. Nothing else was anywhere around there. But that was the nature of the time of the 40s and the early 50s. And so I really enjoyed growing up in that environment.
Was it called the Northside back when you were
a
kid?
Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah. In fact, the idea of it being a separate community, that died many years before that. And then they built Lang Drive to connect the two together.
Your eyes actually lit up when you said that. So you recall when they built Lang Drive?
Oh, sure. Before that, you made your way over the causeway, which wasn't that big of a deal. But that's the way you got from one to the other for many years. And then there was just a kind of a road over the mud patch, and then they actually built Lang Drive, built it up, and so that it was a 12 months, all-season road.
So before they had the bridge, then, did you have to wait for all the trains to get through?
Absolutely. Yeah, those overpasses, both the George Street and the Rose Street ones, were put in very late in the game, in the 50s and the 60s even. You had to wait for trains. And a kind of an interesting one on that, I've mentioned to you that I was president of the Board of Education when we built the new Logan. Well, if you can remember, that Gillette Street going out had to go over all of the railroad tracks, eventually to get out to Highway 16. And I talked, and the city was great about it, talked them into putting that overpass over the railroad tracks.
So you were as the Board of Education was able to talk the city into that?
Oh yes, and they were very cooperative, and they knew me pretty well. In fact, I'm just going to tell you a little story you can use if you want to, and that is when we were building the new Logan, the school board had just become a fiscally independent operation, and the city no longer had to approve everything. But we took it to the city, the building of it, and presented what we were going to do and what we had done in research and all that to know what we were building and why. And they really bought into it and so on. But when we were done, we were the first thing on the agenda. When we were done, walked out to that rotunda area of outside the city hall, outside the council chambers there,
right?
The round thing. And I'm standing there for just a minute. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 aldermen came up. They had to tell me what my father meant to them as they were growing up.
So your dad made a difference to these gentlemen?
Absolutely.
Wow, that's awesome.
In fact, one of the fellows' initials were shot in the ceiling of the back room with a .22. But he was just that kind of a person who would see people who needed and help them with groceries, with a lot of things.
What's the story behind the 22?
Oh, I don't know. They were just fooling around back there, and no big deal. Just having fun and some laughter time, I guess. And but another thing, this liquor store across the street was the only place where the fathers at St. James and St. John's, particularly St. James, they could come and get their communion wine. Well, several times my father would meet them in the middle of the George Street, bring them back to the back room and feed them some food and so on, so they could nicely get back to their rectory back on Caledonia Street.
What was the name of your father's grocery store?
Just Temte's Market.
Huh. Was the grocery store back in those days similar to what a bar or a church is now, where people get together and...
Not well, a little bit, but most of it was just that my father was so welcoming. In fact, another little story about this: there was a family on the north side who lost their home, got kicked out of renting or whatever, and they had a couple of kids. And there was an old, we called it the little house, behind our house, and our house had all of 620 square feet, and this was the little house.
That must have been a tiny house, because you showed me the house you grew up in.
Yeah. Well, anyway, this house, of course, is no longer there. But what he did is he moved that family in there and got some bed furniture and stuff for them that they needed above what they could bring from their apartment or whatever. And they lived in there for several years until they got their things together and could move into another real house. I didn't know about this until one of the sons, who was very much involved with refereeing and youth sports and stuff, saw me and told me the story. And like the 6 aldermen outside in the vestibule area, there were 7 crying men. They had their stories to tell of what my father had meant. Now, my father passed away when I was a young man, 12, 13, I guess it was. So I never knew him as a full adult. But they did, because he was 50 when he passed away. And they had to tell me their story. And they were so moving, the stories, that every one of them sat there, not weeping, but tears of joy telling their story. And the same way with this other young man who was given a place with his father and mother and family to live for a couple of years by my father, who was always giving. And
is that kind of the Temte legacy?
Yeah. I learned a lot from him, and I built my lifestyle around what I did know about him, and that's the way it is.
Right. Were you close with your mother?
Well, after my father passed, yes. In fact, we saw, my wife and I, we saw my mother through to the end. She was a worker, to keep the family together and stuff. But then she moved into Stokey Towers. We got her in there when she was in her 60s. And she lived to 83. And I had I'll say the good fortune, because I worked at Tech. I was vice president of Tech at the time. And I would, if I was running around downtown, I would stop in and check on my mother. Well, one day I did. And she'd gotten up, got half or 3/4 dressed, sat on the bed, and just laid herself back down. And that was the end of it. Mm-hmm. And I walked in and saw it, so I called 911. It wasn't that number then. But anyway, they said, well, Doc Watanya will have to, he was the coroner. And I don't know if the law is still this way, but if somebody died outside of a hospital, the coroner had to come to make sure that everything was fine. And Doc Watanya always had a cigar, never lit, hanging out of his mouth. And he's on that side of the bed, and I'm on this side.
Right.
And he looking at her and rolls up her eyes and stuff. Mr. Temte, he said, she died peacefully. She never suffered a moment. That was good.
Oh, yeah. I bet as a son, that's probably great to hear.
Yeah, it was. So anyway, and the variety of people on the north side, like I say, this one family owned Service Transfer. Finally bought out by, what was the big one? Gateway Transfer, which was the other big one. And other people were very much, we had a doctor and dentists and that sort of thing. And they had their offices on Caledonia Street there, where the old Riviera Theater, it's now junk shops and stuff. But anyway, in the floors above that, that's where they had their doctor's office, their dental office, and that sort of thing. So to go to the doctor, we'd get on our bike and ride down to Caledonia Street.
So that was back in the day before they had Gunderson and Mayo. So it was basically family doctors in the neighborhoods?
Yeah. See, Gunderson had a small clinic. And if you were really in tough shape, the doc dailies would get you there. Like one time, he was called to my house because my brother, was old, he's passed now, but just the next one above me, and he had strep throat so bad, and Doc Daly came, and he said, we got to get him to the hospital right now. My dad was there, and Harvey's Bakery Company was unloading donuts and bread into the store. The guy just cleaned off a shelf, put my brother on one of the shelves, and held him there while he was being driven, or I guess somebody held him there while he was being driven down to the hospital.
Were there ambulances in those days?
Few and far between.
Okay.
Few and far between. And, well, that's one of the things about the Gunderson having that tri-state ambulance, which is so good and available, so available. That's what I mean by good, mostly. And they do a good job, too, but that wasn't the way it was. And people would be taken in the back of a car. But we didn't have a car, and nobody in the neighborhood that had one was anywhere around. So the driver at Harvey's Bakery, that was another down in Caledonia Street area, bakery down there. He drove him down to the hospital.
Did your parents ever own a car, or your father ever own a car?
Never drove one.
Never, ever?
I think he drove one. Yeah, he used to drive one, but never owned one.
Really? Huh.
And we weren't the only ones that didn't have cars. Like the hardware store across the street, they had a pickup truck for delivering big, heavy stuff, but that was their vehicle, period. And, in the 40s, early 50s, you didn't go very far. And like I said, you got on the streetcar and went where you wanted to.
That kind of took you from A to B, and then you had to walk a little bit to get to actually where you're going. Unlike today's people, you want to park as close as you can, and everybody's so damn lazy they don't want to get up and walk over there.
Yeah. Well, one time when I was at a meeting someplace, and I was sitting out in my car waiting for it to start, Minnesota Public Radio had a talk show. I can't remember the name of it. Very popular when it was national, in fact. And the guy says, he was just at Southdale or something like that. The best thing we could do for seniors and people over 50 is force them to park as far away in the parking lot as they can and walk into the mall or the store. The simplicity or the ease of life on the north side and their ability of people to accept and live with their neighbors and stuff without getting all bent out of shape.
What do you attribute that to? Why do you think that was the case?
Well, I think it's because people knew each other. They saw each other on a regular basis. Like, for instance, all the folks that walked to the auto light to go to work. They walked in a big group. And so people knew each other, not driving cars and stuff. They knew each other better. And when you got on the trolley, on the bus or whatever, you're always there with a group of people, and typically they're the same people. I learned this when I was doing some consulting out in the Washington, D.C. area, and I had a job I had to do in Maryland, the Northeast, and my only way to really get there was ride the bus. So I maybe rode the bus. George Washington University is up there, and that was one of the places I had to be. But anyway, the same people. And it didn't take many trips up or back where all of a sudden I knew the people and they knew me.
La Crosse's Northside Stories podcast with Bill Temte is sponsored by Willow Heights, a subdivision just 15 minutes from downtown La Crosse. Find them at willowheightswi.com. The Northside Story podcast is a podcast for hire.com production.